Hey, welcome back to Garbro's Field Desk. I have for you Chapter 6 of the Book 1 redo. Like, subscribe, comment down below. Let's go. Chapter 6. The Beast They Made. Yule blinked the rain out of his eyes as beads of water defied the laws of common sense, tracing down the bottom of his patrol cap's bill to drip onto his face. Cosmoline Company's first dragoons were stretched out in a complex ambush, watching over a road that led to the city of Immelnoris, roughly 3 days' ride away. The trees were heavy here, lining the squiggle of a road like sentries and providing more brush cover than anyone could ever need. According to Imra, the local road patrols hated this place due to the ability for ambushes to happen with little effort, and the wagon traders liked it even less. Yule, however, thought it was a perfect place for an ambush, and set up his dragoons accordingly. The rain tinked off a rifle here, an M249 there, but the deafening roar of falling water drowned out whatever noise was out beyond the trees that lined the road. The rain combined with the tall, dark trees casted long shadows despite the time of day, making it a rather dreary affair. Yule lifted his head ever so slightly from his covering foliage to check his Veil Riders, and heard the elf, Yethis, beside him shift, looking up at him with questioning eyes. Yule placed his finger on his lips, his eyes staring into her wide ones as the sound of rumbling engines grew in the distance. 1 month prior. Cosmoline Company had been dispatched by the Pendulum of Immelnoris, under the directive of King Shay so that he would feel included, to clear out a goblin infestation in a system of caves. The mere mention of exterminating goblins had every human in the Veil Riders pumping on all cylinders, and Yule was a bit surprised by the number of grilled metal helmets that suddenly appeared in his formation, plumes of horsehair included. Yule, being a veteran, wanted to get all the information he could, and pulled in Imra to tell him everything she knew about the goblins they were supposed to eradicate. He had to meet her at a cafe, as she did not like the inn too much, and Yule found it aggravating due to the amount of gawking locals that kept walking past their window seat. "So, what are these things?" Yule asked her, leaning to the side and looking into the kitchen. Within the kitchen he saw an honest-to-God dragon. It was sitting on a countertop, nearly the size of a Maine Coon, and whipped a cook with its tail when the elf tried to pull bread out of the oven too soon. Imra hummed, turning in her chair to follow Yule's amazed gaze.
Oh, those little buggers. Those are called Dondomans, and they are a smaller form of draken.
What? No, not the cooking lizard, Yule said, jerking his eyes from the kitchen and waving his hand in front of his face. I mean the goblins. Imra turned back around in her seat, raising her eyebrows and widening her eyes in an expression of deep disgust.
Yes. Them. The bastard sons of Doroboros, or Doroboros' folly.
Imra began, dumping more milk into her herbal tea.
They are a living weapon devised by a fae turned royal enchanter, unleashed upon the world to cause chaos and death. They breed extremely fast and live off of whatever they kill, creating breeding mounds of rotting flesh to keep their young warm.
Yule swallowed in revulsion, his hand still cupping his own mug of, well, he wasn't really sure what it was, but it tasted good. How big are they?
Same size as harpies, really. Who knows what color you'll find them in either, as the histories say they range from pale white to, dark green, depending on if they've been wallowing.
Imra muttered grossly, dragging out the last word to really hammer home what she thought of goblins. She took a bite from a slice of cake, letting the sugar wipe the taste from her mouth before she continued speaking.
They reproduce quickly and have been around since the Great Fae War. Multiple attempts have been made to try and wipe them out, but even if one survives, it can kill a cow or horse and create an entire clan within days.
Yule took a drink from his mug, then ran the edge of his thumb down his cheek. Y'all tried fire?
It is effective, but you have to render them to ash. It's far better to tear them apart and leave them rotting in the sun.
Imra replied, taking another stab into her slice of cake. If we turn them into small enough pieces, will that do? Yule asked, leaning to the side again to watch the Don Dom and Draculin observe a pot of soup, its tail flicking back and forth patiently. Imra nodded her head from side to side, smacking her lips as she cleaned her fork of icing.
I'd wager that would do.
Then that is the plan, Yule said, and drained his mug clean. The cave itself, which belched out raiding parties of goblins nearly every month, was a 2 days' ruck away, and Yule set out with every man and woman he had at his disposal. He wanted to prove himself to this pendulum, as well as the king of Immelnorris, and show that he was worth investing in. They had yet to hear from Coco, and Yule wanted to get this mission done and over with so he could sort out that problem. Local military and guard units usually dealt with the goblin raiders that left the cave, but none of them were able to root out the problem, only take care of the issues when the pustule came to a head. This always caused deaths, whether of soldier or innocent townspeople, and the problem had been a long-known thorn to both King Shay and the Pendulum. He had been given a wagon and a few horses by King Shay, inside of which the machine guns and Betty rode, barrels pointing out and behind in case a local got froggy. They made good time to the cave, and unloaded themselves out into a ring of meadow that looked into the tree-strewn entrance of the little copse of hills. Yule had figured out the cave was there after getting a good whiff of rotting flesh, being downwind of it. He had dismounted his Veil Riders well before they were in sight of the thing, just in case any goblins were loitering around. None were, which allowed him to unload Betty and get her set up facing the cave. The 2 gunners were busily linking up 4 belts of ammunition, half of what they still had. The rest of the riflemen either laid down amongst the flowers or stayed further back towards the road, using the lone, scattered trees as sight blockers. Yule himself was laying down in the grass next to Betty, looking through a rifle glass since he was pretty sure Coco accidentally took both sets of binoculars. Bringing the rifle glass down, he sighed out angrily. I can't even see them in there, and I don't want to get any closer than this. How are we supposed to lure them out? Could always butcher a horse, they might smell the blood. McCormick said on the other side of Betty, looking back behind him at the closer Valley Elf horse secured to a tree by its halter. Yule shook his head, putting the rifle glass back to his eye and watching the entrance. Nah, then we have to pull that wagon along with the remaining horse, and that will slow us down. Maybe a deer? As Yule and a few other Veil Riders shared ideas, others crawling through the grass to weigh in as well, a female Veil Rider looked to her friend, jerking her chin towards her.
Hey Nellie, you still have that stupid folding fan that guy gave you, right?
Nellie, a woman with hair so orange it nearly glowed, squinted her eyes at the woman beside her, not moving her head from behind her PTR 91.
The one the old man at the market gave me?
Yeah, pull it out,
she said, and stood up from the grass, setting her M4 down next to Nellie. Yule saw this and jerked up into a kneeling position, hissing out to her. Abigail, the fuck are you doing?
I've seen enough anime to know what to do,
Abigail said, and pulled her uniform top up and over her short, undercut hair, the brown strands catching the light.
This always works.
As her buxom chest bounced into view, flagging her sports bra that was quickly becoming ravaged by wear and tear, everyone looked around in pure confusion, while a few others made a low whistle of appreciation.
Ugh, can it, dickheads?
Abigail said as she tossed her uniform top down into the grass, taking a moment to enjoy the warm sunlight.
Now it's time to really start the isekai shenanigans.
Yule, truly at a loss for words, slowly turned his palms toward the sky. What the fuck are you doing?
Baiting,
Abigail murmured, running her thumbs around the waistband of her uniform pants before turning to Nellie.
All right, start fanning.
Nellie exhaled out tiredly, but pulled out her folding fan, clicking it out with a flick of her wrist.
This is fucking stupid, you know that, right? We're fanning from way beyond any range of this working. You'd have to be standing at the cave entrance.
Fan near my stomach. Really get that tomboy smell out there.
Abigail said, ignoring Nellie's comments, and the other woman started to lazily fan at Abigail's stomach muscles, averting her gaze with lowered eyelids.
This is too stupid to not work.
It's definitely stupid, I'll tell you that much.
Nellie muttered, her eyes watching Yule.
Plus, Dad is gonna come over here and yell at you, which means I'm gonna get yelled at too.
Yule got up onto his feet, growling in his throat at the absurdity of his trooper, and snatched up his Mk.II rifle from the grass. Are you fucking serious? The wind is cutting down at us. There is no way the goblins are going to smell your fucking woman stank from this far away. This isn't an anime. Put your uniform back on.
You are correct, Commander.
Nellie lazily drawled, her orange curls blowing in the same direction of the wind.
However, Abigail isn't known for her intelligence.
Abigail looked down at Nellie, her hands on her hips as the other woman kept lazily fanning.
Why do you always have to be so negative?
Get back down, Yule went to shout, but a keening, nearly shriek-like cry echoed out from the cave, and everyone's head snapped around towards the hill. Even Nellie stopped fanning as she looked around Abigail's ass, eyebrows raised towards the cave.
How?
Yule, watching the cave entrance, snatched the fan out of Nellie's hand, going around to where the woman was kneeling and rapidly fanning at Abigail's stomach.
Sir?
Nellie said in a deadpan voice, her eyes leveled at Yule's. I'm just checking something. Yule muttered while fanning hard at Abigail's stomach, who looked quite smug as she crossed her arms and winked at the other Veil Riders. That had to be a fluke or some shit. There's no way this works. The snickering and chuckles were unmasked, and both Yule and Nellie rolled their eyes. After 10 seconds of fanning, a second, even more shrill cry echoed out from the cave, and it was joined by more. The movement of Nellie's hair caught his attention, and Yule watched in horror as her curls began to flutter towards the cave. Son of a bitch. Yule groaned, then twisted his head around as the wind changed fully, blowing towards the cave. Oh, son of a bitch! Get on your guns! Yule pushed Abigail down into the flowers and grass of the meadow as the shrill cries turned into shrieks and screams. The chorus of calls filling the air as he tossed Nellie's fan down to her as well. God damn it, Abigail, if they fight harder because of you, you're fucking fired! Abigail cackled as she got back behind her M4, but not before getting a solid whack from Nellie's fan and being called a thought by her. The screams were so loud now that not even the wind could dampen them. And before anyone was ready, hundreds of goblins came pouring out of the cave, their bodies dark green, gray, and slick from the awful bedding of the breeding den. Despite himself, Yule shuddered out a breath at the sudden charge. They poured out of the cave like a tide of ants, wielding hammers, swords, daggers, and even tree limbs with exposed nails. Most of them were naked, vile-looking with their sagging stomachs, large bugging eyes, pointed ears with drooping earlobes, and large mouths with misshapen fangs. Others wore stolen clothing, and some even wore glinting pieces of armor that caught the sun where the metal was not covered by mud or muck. Yule blinked, staring across at the wave of quickly approaching goblins, then knelt, bringing his rifle to his shoulder and blowing a fist-sized hole into one of the creature's chests. It jerked, stumbled, then rolled along the grass, spittle and shit cartwheeling out into the air. Open fire! Yule roared as he fired again, and the gun line boomed to life. Betty's gunners held down the butterfly trigger, tracing the M2 heavy machine gun in a raking line. The heavy rounds ripped through the goblins like the miniature fists of an angry god, bodies tearing apart wetly as the round kept going, punching through another goblin behind the first. Nellie angrily fired her PTR-91, cleaning heads off of shoulders like pumpkins getting hit by sledgehammers. Plumed, helmeted figures rushed forward, swords and axes held aloft as they bellowed their war cries. "Are you fucking insane?" Yule screamed at them, but started throwing hand signals to shift fire away from the 5 men running out to meet the goblins charging them. By the time the 5 men had met their first goblin, the gun line had cleaved through enough bodies that only 20 or so made it alive to get into the melee. Yule called out to the riflemen to charge, clicking his own bayonet into place as he started running forward. Ahead of him, the lightly armored humans were smashing the goblins apart as if they were made of wet wood pulp, swords and axes cleaving limbs and chunks of torso away with ease. The goblins appeared mightily taken aback by the sudden onslaught, wavering as 10 of their kind were smashed, chopped, or cut to pieces.
"Goblins!"
One of the humans howled from inside his helmet, hefting his axe up and using the broad, flat side of it to brain one of the smarter goblins that was wearing a helmet. Another human Veil Rider, wielding a sword he likely borrowed from a local, kicked a goblin down onto the ground. It tried to scrabble backwards, perhaps for the first time feeling fear as the human advanced on it, speaking out from the darkness inside the helmet.
"The only good goblin is a dead goblin. Let's make these good goblins you and I."
The goblin let out a guttural shriek as it turned to run, but the sword tip punching through the middle of its chest cut its cries short. The 5 melee Veil Riders continued on, body checking and hewing through goblins that trickled out of the cave. As the riflemen joined them, Betty and the other gunners laced shots over their heads towards the mouth of the cave. Yule was finally able to get his bayonet in a goblin of his own, and found them to be oddly light as he lifted his rifle and threw the body across the grass. He sidestepped another Veil Rider, swinging his rifle around like a club, cracking a goblin so hard across the head its skull deformed, the body crumpling to the ground with a gurgle. When Yule and the rest of the riflemen made it to the mouth of the cave, the howling Veil Riders wearing helmets were 7 feet within, still crushing through goblins like a thresher through stalks of wheat. "Explosive packs!" Yule roared out over the din, slinging his rifle as he pulled out his own grenades. 3 Veil Riders whipped off their rucksacks, pulling fuses out of the top flaps and preparing them for a 30-second run. 6 other Veil Riders prepped grenades as well, then all stood poised around the cave. "Get the fuck out of that cave before we bury you in it!" Yule bellowed, letting both spoons of his grenades clang into the air and winging both grenades over the heads of the melee Veil Riders. The squalling mass of goblins both trying to surge forward and retreat, making a grand mess of things in the cave entrance. As Yule's grenades detonated down within the cave and showered the walls with spatters of gore, the riflemen both took over covering the cave entrance and hauling back the helmeted Veil Riders, their weapons covered in enough meat and gristle that the metal wasn't even visible. It took 15 Veil Riders to haul their brothers away from the cave opening, screaming and howling like madmen the entire way, and let the others do their work. Yule pulled out 2 more grenades as riflemen shot into the cave, cutting down the braver goblins as the others threw their grenades in, the concussive claps of air deafening as the cave amplified them. Yule pulled out the pins to 2 more grenades, then held them in his fists as he gestured to the explosive pack bearing humans. "Remember what I said. 1 far, 1 halfway, 1 close. Go!" The more muscled human turned, roaring as he hammered through his lit explosive pack down into the cave. The lit fuse was visible all the way until it landed, telling both Yule and the other man hurling his pack that the cave was nearly a straight entrance all the way down. The second man gave a quick, turning spin, hurling his own explosive pack into the cave as well. The third man slung his pack down into the cave the same time Yule threw his grenades. Then all parties involved started sprinting away from the cave entrance, weaving through the trees until they burst back out into the meadow. As they lost elevation, the machine guns could open back up, throwing rounds into the cave entrance as the grenades cooked off within, throwing plumes of dust into the air. Yule was halfway to the M2 gunners when the first explosive pack went off, and he felt the ground shudder under his feet.
Yule, look out!
Mullen called out, pointing out to the meadow. Yule had enough time to run sideways and avoid the divot in the earth as part of the underground cave system collapsed, and it only got worse when the second explosive pack went off. More arteries of the cave collapsed underneath the meadow, and panic was starting to grip the Veil Riders as they began sprinting for their lives, the ground rumbling and shuddering under their feet.
We used too much!
Mullen called out, his legs pumping as he hauled the M2's tripod with the help of Cole.
We used way too much!
The third explosive detonated, and the entire entryway to the cave went from being physical to physics. Rock, stone, dirt, and chunks of trees were thrown into the air in a great dust cloud, the shockwave bowling over Veil Riders and shrubs alike. Yule was thrown aside as he broke over the berm towards the road, and had to roll in order to avoid the horse running him over, panicking and sprinting towards safety. The ground grumbled, groaned, and thundered under them as chunks of cave, earth, and tree thudded down onto the ground, and Yule slowly lifted his head. His ears were ringing, and his eyes were full of dust from the shockwave of the third explosive pack, but he could easily see that the hill had been completely removed, replaced with a massive crater that was filling with water from an underground river. Yule turned his head, coughing, and saw Mullen laying nearby, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. Yule sat up, groaning as he spoke. How much C4 did you even use? I said 1 brick a bag plus shards of metal.
There was C4 in there.
Mullen wheezed, sitting up with some struggle and rolling around onto his knees.
Imra gave us some stuff from her alchemical building.
Yule shook his head, then pulled his K2 around off of his back. What was it?
Some shiny white stuff.
Mullen said with a groan, slowly coming up onto his feet.
It smelled like bananas, and she said it would make the C4 work better.
Yule slowly stepped up onto the berm, looking around at the destruction caused by the upgraded explosive packs. The hill was missing entirely. The trees had been blown down as well, and there were deep trenches in the ground where the cave had collapsed. The river was filling the huge basin where the cave was, and water was trickling out of little torrents in the soil. He groaned, running a hand through his dusty hair.
What?
Mullen asked, slowly dusting himself off.
We killed the goblins, right?
Yeah? Yule said with a heavy sigh, slapping his hands to the thighs of his pants. But the king is going to be asking where his gold mine went. When they had gotten back to the city, the pendulum had been quite impressed by Yule's efficiency. Yule was granted the prize of not only a place that welcomes his troopers with open arms, but also a translation amulet of his own, which needed magic-infused blood in order to work. Imra, hearing about the loss of the old mine, went to assuage things with King Shay, leaving behind one of her assistants to help Yule. The rather eager female valley elf named Yethis had inserted herself into the company happily, and was to be Yule's blood supply for the amulet, as well as a technical advisor. She was a chipper sort, her face soft, kind, and framed nicely by her straw bale-colored hair, which she usually wore in a long braid. With her lightly freckled face, happy amber eyes, and full hips, she was naturally adopted quite readily into the company. Humans in the company doted on her as if she were a new family member, going out of their way to make her feel welcomed, except for Yule and Gremlin. Gremlin believed her to be annoying, finding herself furious on multiple mornings when she would wake up to find Yethis had braided her hair as she slept. Yule thought her unwarranted affection was draining, and found himself having to fight her to get his own food or do his own laundry. When it came to the amulet, he was warned not to use his own blood, as it could break the enchantment that was placed upon it. So, Yule had to rely on this younger-looking elf girl to cut herself open and drain her own original recipe into the little bottle. He didn't gel with the idea, to be frank, but he took their warning to heart. This brought his troop count to 67, the ladies of Cosbling Company having a lovely time rigging out the elf in their spare uniforms, and found her a sidearm to use as well. Yethis could also make use of healing magic, which caused a lot of the Veil Riders to breathe easy for a change in case of boo-boos and bang-bang holes. This was doubly light due to the mishap at the cave, which, while no one died, a healer would have come in handy for all the lacerations. Gremlin managed to get in touch with Zerg Company, but not in the way she thought she would. She had run out of ways to power her drones reliably, since the batteries took too long to charge on the solar charger and there was no fuel to spare for the generators. To get around this, Gremlin came into negotiations with the harpies that lived in the city of Immelnoris. With a bit of coin, she managed to work out a deal with them to carry messages between Zerg Company and Cosbling Company. For the first time in a long time, Coco and Yule had to write reports to each other by hand, something their wrist and penmanship were not fond of. A harpy would then take the letter and fly off with it, being dubbed the Pumparome Delivery Service by the Veil Riders. The harpies, for one reason or another, took to the name with pride, and would eagerly cry out,
Pomparom!
when they swooped down to land nearby and deliver their packages or letters. Zerg Company had made their way to Archery, a mixed town much like Immelnoris. However, they had chosen to make a small encampment on the outside of the city, while Cosbling Company had made their base more or less inside the Sparkling Unicorn. Coco convinced a few druids to help him move Earth around after seeing them practicing the craft one morning, in which the Veil Riders of Zerg Company made a star fort. It was ringed with pointed timbers, and they had dubbed it Fort Kickass Return of the Zerg. The locals of Archery adored both Coco and his riders due to their naturally charismatic nature, and the humans had taken to teaching the locals how to make fancier soaps and lotions. While reading the report on the day it arrived, Yule had read the bit about the soap and blinked to himself a few times, turning and speaking across the inn. That's actually a pretty good idea. Hey Cole, do you know how to make soap? The slice of life enjoyment changed sharply when a harpy that had been sent on a special mission returned to Yule directly, blood streaming down his shoulder from what looked like birdshot. Cosbling Company bristled at the knowledge that someone had tried to shoot down their little spy harpy, but it didn't take a huge leap of brain power to figure out who it was. Their little spy was a sparrow harpy who introduced himself as Chikily, answering the call when Yule requested a flyer with a bit of a daredevil in their heart. Chikily was tasked with watching over the veil and keeping track of what was spewed out of it, and had been coming back and forth with reports of personnel movements, resources being brought in or taken out, and anything else of note. What had gotten Chikily shot was his attempts to get close enough and talk to some of the local valley elves that were taken from the town called Sanrion, the one just outside the Vale that Yule had visited. A small contingent of them had been marched up to the small base the Ewan had built up around the Vale, and were quickly put to work building lookout towers, personnel buildings, and doing other general labor. Chikily then had seen the southern elves strutting around the compound and hurling abuse at the valley elves, which is what finally drove him to dive down and try to speak to them.
Chikily see many valley elves digging, building, carving wood. Valley elves all look sad while southern elves preen and sometimes smack other elves with sticks. Blue hats also building things. They put together wagons with big wheels that growl like monsters. Little Cap much bigger now, stretching out and swallowing land around cave. Many people now, and elves.
Chikily said painfully, grimacing as Jacob, or Gruesome as the rest called him, dug out the pellets from his shoulder. Gruesome was a former Navy corpsman, carrying with him a scarred face from an IED that forced him into early retirement. When Gruesome would pluck out a little ball of steel, Yethis would touch the wound and heal it, the flesh curling back over itself and covering the hole.
Chikily tried to talk to valley elves. They sad, scared, told to come or bad things happen. They sleep outside of the fort on grass. Blue Hat see Chikily, shout at Chikily, then shoot when Chikily fly away.
Chikily said, shaking his head and hissing as another pellet was pulled from his flesh. Yule patted Chikily's head, then gave his cheek a soft pinch. You done good, Chikily. Thank you. Pump-a-Rum should be proud of such a brave sparrow harpy like you. Chikily's chest swelled with pride and fire as he grinned up at Yule, and Yule grinned back before looking over at his NCOs. Domino, who had been promoted to such a Veil Rider rank, flicked a coin off his thumb with a crisp cling while grinning from ear to ear. Yule clapped his hands together, and Domino caught his coin, the rest of the NCOs sitting up and rolling their shoulders. No stick-wielding goblin noise this time. There's something going on at the Vale, and there are apparently southern elves already acting chummy with the humans coming through. Yule said, pointing at a map that was spread out on the end table, one he had borrowed from Imra. I told you this whole thing reeks. Get some men together. We're going to go take a look. Cosbling Company whirled into motion as everyone loaded themselves out to the gills with the ammunition they could spare. There were shortages, but there was some help from the special magics that whirled around this realm. The dwarves in particular had a special kind of sack that could duplicate certain things inside of it, which once discovered was immediately put to work. Sack was a generous term, though, as it was more like a small coin purse. Getting back ammo was a slow and tedious process, as it took almost a week for the complex chemistry of the bullet to be reproduced. They had, however, pioneered the science of lubricants, which was fantastic news for the health of Cosbling Company's weapons. A message was sent to Zerg Company, carried defiantly by Chikily, while Yule hired a female hawk harpy named Eris to stick with him to carry messages. When every rider had their gear in order and the throng was mustered, all of the company's elements moved out of the city. This time they had proper wagons and horses, something a lot of the Veil Riders highly enjoyed, including Yule. Like Yule, a lot of the men and women of Cosbling Company were from the South or Midwest, and grew up learning how to ride horses. 30 of the Veil Riders were on horseback, the rest driving or riding in wagons, allowing them to have a wing of dragoons with Yule heading them. Saddles were modified for the carrying of Betty and the other machine guns, but other than that, they were a force that could ride out, deploy, and ambush in quick succession. That same wing of dragoons and wagon-borne troopers lay out in the sopping wet grass now, watching down the road that ran from Sanrion to Emil Norris. Yethis looked to Yule, and very slowly raised her head from the ground cover he and her lay behind.
What is it?
She asked timidly, her voice tight with excitement and fear. Vehicles. Keep your head down. Yule said lowly, grabbing her shirt collar with a finger and jerking her head down. It was annoying corralling her, as sometimes the amulet inside his uniform didn't make full contact with his flesh, and he had to yank her around like a toddler. They had been on their way to the Vale when Eris had seen
little boxes
moving down the road, causing Yule to deploy his men and women in a hasty ambush position, unsure of what could be coming at them. He nodded to Domino across the road in the other ambush position and held up his hand in front of his face, then pointed to Domino. Do you see? Domino gripped the brim of his field cap.
I see.
Yule made a fist and moved it from side to side, then pointed to his eye. Vehicles. You see? Domino gave him a thumbs up, held up his 3 middle fingers, then made an L shape with his hand.
I see. 6 trucks.
Yule made a trigger pull action with his hand, then pointed to his eye again. You see infantry. Domino again gave him a thumbs up, held up an O shape with his fist, then another one next to it. He then made an L shape with his pointer finger and thumb, and held it as high as he dared.
I see infantry. 20 rifles.
Yule held up an OK hand gesture at him, pointed to his ear, and then at himself. Listen for me. Domino nodded, hunkered down in his cover, and looked down his scope. Chix was next to him, and she slowly chewed a local gum replacement as she stared down her optics, her blonde hair so soaked it stuck to her uniform and cheeks. Yule turned to Yethis, speaking in a hushed voice as the trucks drew closer, placing his chest against her head so the amulet would activate between them. Stay low, don't scream. It's going to get very loud, and a lot of people are going to die. Yethis looked at him wide-eyed before he threw the netting over her to conceal her. Then he began to low-crawl along the side of the road's brush line. The rain-soaked foliage dragged along his uniform as he made his way to the main battery of M240 Bravos and Betty, which stared straight down the road from the curve they lay on. The sound of rumbling engines was barely audible over the heavy rain, and he didn't want to risk getting caught in any headlights. The gunners stared hawkishly down their sights or optics at the oncoming tan HMMVs that had come into partial view through the trees, an overly large blue UN spray painted on the hoods. Yule thought it odd and creepy that they were using U.S. military hardware and putting such blatant symbols on the hood, but shook the idea from his mind as he crawled up next to his heavy hitters. Turn that first truck into Swiss cheese with Betty. Ding anyone running for it with the 240s. Yule said over the roar of the rain, the water dripping off of him in rivers and making flecks of moisture pop away from his lips when he spoke. The gunners and the weapons weren't doing much better, water pouring off of them in streams. They nodded, and Yule crawled on to the rest of the Veil Riders hiding in shallow fighting holes and obscured from sight along the brush line. The tall bushes allowed Yule to come up onto his feet, but he still had to hunch over. Betty's going to take the first truck. Shoot to kill. Any prisoners are just a bonus, Yule said, clapping Cole on the shoulder as he stepped over him at a low hunch, his boots thudding soppily on the standing water that lay about. He knelt against a wide tree, making sure that he could see Domino on the other side. The buttstock of Yule's Mk.II was in his shoulder at a low ready as he slowly leaned his head around the edge of the tree trunk, his hat covered with nettles and wet leaves. He could see the lead vehicle was about 100 yards away, the diesel engine growling as it trundled along at slow speeds due to the road being so worn and potholed. The engines were louder now, the grumble and crank of the diesels now more audible over the still roaring rain. Water spattered across the windows, the wipers fighting for control over the heavy rain, and the gunners within the turrets looked miserable. Yule looked at Domino, then told him to hold fire. He pointed at a smaller male Veil Rider and gave him a thumbs up. Yule had planned for a trooper to run across the road in order to gauge what the reaction would be from the enemy. If they stopped, there may be time for talking. If they opened fire, there would be no talking at all. At the signal, the trooper stood and ran across the road, his boots splashing loudly in the muddy water with squelching steps. The oncoming vehicles did not stop, and instead of such, the lead vehicle's gunner let loose a spray of bullets that kicked up water and chased a Veil Rider across the road, spattering mud behind the man in thick plumes. The trooper dove into the safety of the brush. Then Yule looked at Betty's gunners, making a chopping motion with his hand. There was a pause, a click, then Betty thumped into action, sending 50 caliber rounds shredding down the road and into the front of the lead truck. The concussion from her muzzle sent water flying when a round left the barrel, and steam began to slowly rise from her receiver as water made contact with the heated metal. Tracers hissed and danced through the air, steel sparking harshly as the burning round burrowed its way inside the vehicle. The lead truck's pristine front window suddenly had a cluster of holes in it as the gunner's aim traversed from high left to low right, the driver being turned into a blood-covered sponge as soon as 3 rounds made contact with him. His window had been cracked to let a bit of air in, and a crimson spray flew out of it and down onto the road thickly. Yule noticed with curiosity, as he lifted his Mk.II and shot the gunner in the chest from near point-blank range, that there were an awful lot of people in that Humvee. He could tell this from the amount of blood that came pouring out from the bottoms of the light doors that they had on it, there being gaps here and there, and it spilled out onto the road as if the HMMV were a can of cherry juice being shot with BB guns. The gunner screamed from the round bursting out the back of his chest and lurched forward to grab the M240 Bravo mounted to the gunner ring and get it back to firing. Domino stood up sharply and shot once, the entire top of the man's skull spattering onto the back of the rear hatch cover, and he thudded lifelessly on top of the machine gun. Chicks fired as well, and another gunner in a middle truck screamed out in horror as his heart was turned to mush and blown out of his own shoulder blade. Betty chunked out a few more rounds and went quiet, rain hissing and pinging off the M2's barrel, and soldiers from the other HMMVs began to spill out. A scattering of accents flew into the air as they all tried to dismount into the ruts off the side of the road for cover. It was when they were all in the open that the Veil Rider's own M240 Bravos thundered in challenge of their big sister, joined by the rhythmic staccato of the rifles cutting down men and women left and right. World War II, Korean, Vietnam, and Gulf War rifles barked to life and shed blood once again, speaking for the first time in proper battle after being at rest for so long. Extractors sang as brass flew through the air, their payloads expended into the bodies or doors of the enemy before them. Angry lead shot buzzed and hissed through the wet air before thudding into flesh and bone, the cries of the stricken and dying echoing off the trees along with the reports of gunfire. Bodies crumpled onto the rain-soaked road as they were hit mid-step, faces splashing down into the wells of muddy water as tracers rang and zipped in the air. The lead truck, having never been put into park or the brake applied, continued to roll forward as the dead driver's ruined head wobbled from side to side, turning slightly as it began to rumble towards the ambush lines. Yule stepped forward and signaled for the rest of the rifles to move up, waving his hand from side to side to tell the machine guns to cease fire. As the Veil Riders mopped up anyone who kept fighting, Yule opened the driver's side door to the lead truck, walking along with it as he reached over to turn the engine selector off. The HMMV's engine rumbled into silence and the wheels slowed to a stop. He looked at the driver, who was missing large chunks of meat from his torso, and wrinkled his nose. Gross. Yule leaned in further as the crack and pop of a rifle here and there echoed outside, and looked over the remains of an officer sitting in the passenger seat, along with a roll of papers in the Valley Elf language still clutched in his blood-stained hands. Yule reached over and lifted the blue field cap the officer wore, observing the man's slackened face and guessing he could have been German or maybe even French. He took his finger away from the bill of the cap and looked into the passenger area of the HMMV, giving a low whistle. The HMMV was completely packed. Yule seeing that some bodies actually lay dead in the rear compartment or slumped over the middle divider where the dead gunner's feet dangled. To avoid walking and getting wet, the UN soldiers had packed themselves into the HMMV, cramming 8 bodies in a space designed for only 4. Yule snatched the scrolls up, spat on the ventilated corpse of the officer, then leaned out of the bullet hole-riddled vehicle, the rivulets of blood from the bottom of the door still dripping onto the road. Yethis ran up beside him, sputtering in her language, and Yule dragged out the amulet, touching it to his temple.
Hurt? Are you hurt?
She cried, checking his clothing as if she expected him to be full of holes. Yethis knew that if she managed to not only let Yule get hurt, but also die, Imra would have ripped the skin from her body and used it as a coat. Yule chuckled, brushing her hands away gently as she tried to open his uniform top. I'm fine, Yethis. Go check on the others. Yethis sped off, yelling and waving a hand at the other Veil Riders, and saw one human raise his hand, having caught a rifle round to the hip. Gremlin and Domino came trotting up to him, and the 3 walked down the road towards the other body-covered Humvees.
One survivor, German female. She took a 5.56 to the leg and went down, then hid behind the wheels of her truck.
Domino said, pointing her out. She was currently pinned to the ground with a knee in her back, another Veil Rider tying her hands securely with rope.
Lots of fuel in these heaps.
Gremlin piped up, patting an almost pristine Humvee that just had a hole or two where the gunner was mowed down.
Should keep my gunnies running for a while.
And ammo. And food. Yule murmured, looking in the rear of the truck and seeing stacks of ammo cans. Overall, 29 UN soldiers were gunned down on the road with no losses to the Veil Riders' 1st Dragoons, though there were injuries that were shored up by the quick healing of Yethis. The hisses and muted screams of Veil Riders giving birth to bullets was a consistent noise over the rain, the healing magic sealing the wound slowly until the lead shot was popped out of the flesh like a cyst. While the lead truck was a mess, the other trucks were in usable condition, toting a lot of hardware and supplies to boot. For one reason or another, these trucks were loaded down with almost 2 weeks' worth of food and ammo, as well as explosives and detonators. To Yule, this made no sense to him. They knew he was out here and was using Harpies to scout. Why would they send packed vehicles driving down a well-used road? Moreover, why did they have so much supplies with them? And why were those inside of the vehicles European? Yule held the amulet to his temple and yelled up into the rainy sky, "Eris, ma'am, I need you." Eris flitted down from a tree nearby, having watched the show from the safety of both elevation and behind a thick trunk. She landed neatly on the back of a nearby dead UN soldier, his blue helmet falling away from his head. She lifted her chin to Yule, her claws digging into the bleeding flesh of the cooling corpse, and gave her wet hair a shake, flicking water onto multiple Veil Riders nearby. "Could you please go tell Coco that the ambush was a success? We have vehicles and more ammo if he needs them." Yule told her, then handed her a few other additional letters.
Eris hears.
Eris purred as Yule tucked the letters into her vest pocket, and then opened her wings wide, beating them until she was clear into the sky and heading east. Yule watched her go, making sure no one was going to try and shoot her down from some unknown location, then moved on down the road. The rain still hammered them from the sky, soaking gear, hair, and flesh alike until nothing dry remained. Red trails of crimson spidered out like little miniature rivers from the bodies that lay on the rough gravel and dirt of the road, coursing along like moving snakes. Judging from their shocked and surprised faces, they never expected the Veil Riders to be here, let alone so many of them. Ooga booga. Yule murmured to himself as he kicked one of their blue helmets into the brush, then turned, looking at the littering of bodies along the roadway. It could have been very different, he knew that, as he had a plan in place if the vehicle stopped after his rather obvious signal had been sent by the man running across the road. What really burned Yule, as he stepped along the muddy road, was how easy it was. Things should never be easy, never so cut and dry. Was it an itchy trigger finger that sealed the fate of this convoy? Did they have orders to fire on any human they came across using modern war gear? If so, why would they even be given those orders to start with? The Veil Riders were stripping bodies of ammo plus anything else of use and tossing them into the trucks, while a growing stack of weapons was in the rear trunk of another. Little ceremony was given to the bodies, just being chucked off the side of the road to clear it. Those who knew how were already moving the HMMVs and driving them back towards where their horses were staked, and they rumbled by as Yule knelt down in front of their only captive. Her back was to a tree, placed there while her wound had been seen after. Gruesome had already yanked out the slug, and Yethis had healed the wound, but still she bared her teeth at those around her, her eyes shining angrily. She was definitely German, her jaw strong, chestnut brown hair cut short, and brown eyes that glimmered with little sparks of honey here and there. Though her nationality was still quite easy to decipher from how she spoke, calling the Veil Riders all a manner of rude words in Deutsch. Her face contorted with both fury and fear as she craned her neck to and fro, the rain spattering off of her face and off of those around her. Veil Riders stood nearby, squatting down while smoking local vices or cleaning the blood from their knives on the bodies of the dead. The one thing they all shared was the resentful look that was cast down upon her, and panic began to crawl up her neck in a red flush. Yule knelt down in front of her, the buttstock of his Mk.II splashing onto the ground as he used it for support. He took a moment to take out his well-worn and chewed corncob pipe and tucked it into his mouth, clenching it in his teeth as he gave her the grin that all predators have when the hunt has gone well. He pressed the amulet to his temple, still smiling down at her as he spoke. No one around Yule could hear him murmuring to her in German, but as he spoke, the fury and anger slowly left her eyes, terror and alarm causing them to widen and skin to pale. She sputtered back at him in German as Yule stood up, pulling the amulet away from his flesh, and she started to jerk and thrash, kicking her booted feet along the wet grass as she continued to yell at Yule. She screamed out as Yule snapped his fingers, Veil Riders grabbing her around the shoulders at the command, and the woman let out a howl of dread as they hauled her to her feet, dragging her towards one of the HMMVs. And that's the end of Chapter 6 of Book 1, Mark II, the redo, whatever you want to call it. If you like this story and others like them, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel of Garbro's Field Desk. Join us on the Discord. Join us on Coffee and become a member. Get those sneak peeks, get those discount codes, get those teasers. And I suppose you can follow me on X. Why not? I post cringe shit there all the damn time. Now all Coffee members get their names said at the end of the video, and first up we have our first shirts. These guys give $50 per month and help the channel stay afloat. That's E-Machino, Cody Jero, Desk Dancer, and Insane Medic. Next up is the E4 Mafia. These guys give $25 per month and continue to help shore up the things we need to help pay for, like art and VAs and such. That's the Great Baguette, what the fuck? The Great Baguette, Sonic Arrow, Splug the Goblin, Dark Side, Kiwi Bastard, Lacune 8, Josh Beatty, Matty Boy, and Crusader 0625. Then there's Snuffig Squad. These guys give $5 per month. That's Super Stink 64, Elderock, Chrome Man, Karina Kestrel, Dalek, Jules, Blonde Lore, Thrace Vega, Devin Schonholtz, Andrew N. Gill, Yeti Potato, Skelters, Kite Zero, Classic Cthulhu, Ranger Uninspired, Diesel Dog, Coffee Commander, Anto, Inquisitor Matt, Duncan D, and Ein, the Loresmith. And until we see you next time on this side of the veil, that was Fire, that was Rue, that was Technoward, that was Hailey, that was Eliza, and this is Garbro's Field Desk. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.